welcome everyone. I'm Tina Polito. I'm the lead access specialist here at the DRC and a certified autism specialist. We're going to be talking about supporting students with autism today. I don't know if anybody's already been to my presentation in previous quarters. This is a repeat, so I apologize. So it might be same information or it might be new if this is your first time. But I also like to make my presentations a little bit more sort of Q&A discussion, so feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me. We can have this kind of a discussion forum too. Especially because there's such a small audience, it makes it a little bit easier. All right, so let's get started. Do I know how to use this thing? Okay. All right, so just some basic objectives of what we're going to talk about today. So kind of a brief overview on what is autism spectrum disorder, why is autism awareness so important these days, what struggles do our students on the spectrum face, specifically here at Cal Poly, and what can we do to help our students with autism, and then just some campus and community resources. Oops. So what is ASD? So autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder or a neurocognitive disability, and it affects communication and behavior primarily. And characteristics can include impairments with social interactions, difficulty with communication, restricted interest, repetitive or stereotype behaviors. Often students with autism struggle with communication, kind of like the social relations and sometimes with sensory processing issues. So, but like I said, everybody with autism is sort of an individual. So my favorite quote is, you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism. So these are just kind of general characteristics. So really it can kind of vary from student to student, but these are just kind of, like I said, generalities. So when we're talking about sort of the students with autism, there used to be certain ways we used to categorize them or diagnose them, and under the DSM-4, which is a Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And then there is the new Diagnostic Statistical Manual. So it used to be it's a spectrum, obviously, but there used to be things called Asperger's syndrome, which I think probably people have heard of, or Rett syndrome, but those have kind of fallen down. Those are no longer diagnosed anymore. It's now all under just autism spectrum disorder under the new DSM. And so this is sort of like a good little chart of what that looks like. And really what they're looking at is that expressive language level. And that's sort of what they're determining, what level of support that student will need when they're making their diagnosis. So they're really looking at, is there the social communication level and sort of, is there fixed or restricted interest? So they're not really sort of getting that nitpicky detail anymore like they used to. So when we're talking about the student with ASD, so particularly the college student, so like I said, every individual on the spectrum is unique, but things you might see, they might use an odd or sometimes awkward gestures, phrases, or their gait. Limited eye contact is fairly common. Sensitivity to external or internal stimuli. What that can look like is some students might have sensitivity to maybe the overhead lighting, or maybe certain sounds that they might hear. And so if maybe right now the cars can be really loud and that could be very distracting. Certain things like that, things that maybe a neurotypical student can kind of drown out, our student on the spectrum might be really hyper-focused on, and that could cause some issues. When we talk about stereotypy or repetitive motor mannerisms, what that is sometimes we call it stimming. It's just kind of a jargony term. It's a form of self-soothing, and it could look like you might have seen students flapping or kind of rocking back and forth, things like that. That's what we talk about. We call it stereotypy. I used to work with little kids for a long time, and we used to say, I'm flapping when I'm happy, because that would if they got really excited, that was their output. And so you would see that a lot sometimes. We see it sometimes in our students today too. Sometimes that behavior just continues. That's just their output, and that's fine. We talk a lot about black and white thinking, that very rigid sometimes, this is the way it is, very rule-bound thinking. And again, with the limited interests or activities. And so, not all of these things every student has, but again, these are just common generalities, things that we see a lot. A lot of our students with autism, they may have adequate expressive language skills, but can struggle with that social reciprocity, sort of like that give and take of a conversation. kind of emotional, ironic language can be especially difficult. Sort of picking up on those nonverbal cues. So, I have a student sometimes, and we have this conversation a lot where he's not picking up on those cues sometimes when a person wants to leave the conversation or wants to be done. So if he goes to office hours, he might be monopolizing that professor's time. He might not see the professor checking his watch multiple times. It's sort of a cue to like, oh, they might have something else going on, or I need to wrap it up. Or even the professor getting up and walking out of the room. If the professor's not saying, I need to end this, if they're not being that clear, they're not maybe picking up on that specific nonverbal cue of like, oh, this conversation is done. And that's run into problems before. So that's, sometimes we talk about these things. So just kind of things like that. This is kind of my favorite graphic. Just an example of black and white thinking. Just if it's just says find X and they're circling, here it is. Sometimes we need to this is just kind of me being silly and sarcastic, but again, it's sort of giving your student a little bit more context when you're asking something of them. It's sort of, find X on the graph below, what is the value? So of being asking them specifically what you're asking for, because sometimes you might just get an answer like that and technically it's correct. So that's just a silly graphic. This next chart, so this is just some common behavioral misconceptions that you might see in the classroom or you might see working with students. So I'll just, I think it could be kind of small on the screen here, so I can just kind of go over it. But say you have a student who maybe has their head on their desk. It could seem like maybe they're sleeping, but maybe they're just having sensory overload. Maybe, like I said, those overhead lights are really getting to them, or the noise outside, and they really just need to put their head down. Or maybe they're mimicking or reciting back something you said to them, and you're like, that's just really rude. That could just be they're needing time to sort of process, or something we call echolalia. There's two different types of echolalia. There's either delayed echolalia, meaning they're repeating something they heard from a commercial or a song, and they find that soothing, so they keep repeating it, or immediate echolalia, where they're reciting something that you said 2 minutes ago. And that could just be sort of that processing, sort of just part of that. You see that a lot more in younger children, but it's not that it's unheard of in adults, but it could happen. They might have great expressive skills. So you might come across an individual with autism who can just talk and talk and talk at great length about maybe a certain topic or something they're interested in. And that might give you sort of an overestimation of their functioning. But it could be compensating for sort of those receptive skills that, like we talked about, those nonverbal sort of skills that maybe that they're lacking. They might have sort of odd speaking habits. They can be kind of pedantic, things like that. That might kind of seem inappropriate in some situations, but it could just be those pragmatic language deficits, like we talked about. Maybe they're not responding to facial expressions or certain tones, and that could lead to a lot of different miscues, especially in certain social groups, maybe group work. That's happened a lot. But again, that could just be that difficulty with the nonverbals. Maybe you're coming across a student that you've met multiple times, they just don't recognize you. You're like, that just seems really aloof, or that's, again, kind of rude. But sometimes students with autism have that limited facial recognition. It's kind of that face blindness. So that can happen. And maybe they're not shifting on topic on cue. And that can come across as maybe self-absorbed, or they're uninterested. But again, it's sort of that they're not automatically sort of catching on. It's, again, maybe they're interested in a certain topic and they want to stay on that topic. This can be especially problematic in social situations when their peers are wanting to move on and talk about different things, but our student is sort of, no, I want to keep talking about this one thing. And so that could be challenging. So that leads me to, why is autism awareness so important? So on April 26, 2018, this is kind of a little old, but always when we're looking at numbers and things like that, data is always a couple years behind than the current date. The CDC released the new data of the prevalence, saying 1 in 59 children is having an autism spectrum diagnosis. So that's, at approximately half the population diagnosed with ASD has average to above average intellectual ability. And actually part of the diagnostic criteria is that your IQ is average or above average. So sometimes that's a little bit of a misnomer. And there's been increased enrollment in college, especially in the STEM majors as of recently. So I think that's something for especially Cal Poly to be aware of, that these numbers are increasing, that means our numbers are going to be increasing, and we need to really have that support kind of in place and sort of the awareness in place. You know, because these students are coming, they're here. And yes, we have the Disability Resource Center, but students have to self-identify. So I think our numbers are not truly reflective of the students that have autism on our campus, because they might not know that they need accommodations, or maybe they don't need accommodations, but they just need extra support. So that happens. This is just a graphic that I found that I want to discuss, because I think, especially in today's world, we're talking about pandemics and epidemics, and what does that look like? What does that mean? Especially when they say 1 in 59 children have ASD, that sounds like a really scary number. What does that mean? As opposed to in 2004, when it was 1 in 166, where did that jump happen? Well, a big jump happened because our diagnostic criteria changed. So a lot of students that weren't getting diagnosed way back when would now be diagnosed today, just because we have broader criteria, we have better tools for diagnosing. And I think the stigma isn't as, it's terrible to say, but isn't as bad as it used to be. And so, like in the early 90s, I think a lot more students were being diagnosed with things like attention deficit disorder, maybe sensory processing disorder, but the label of autism, a lot of parents didn't want to put on their child for what that was. And so they were getting differential diagnoses. And so now I think that stigma has gone down a lot. And like I said, our criteria has gotten broader. So I think that's a big part of why our numbers have increased. So hopefully it doesn't sound as scary when people look at these kinds of charts. Just something to keep in perspective. There is still no known cause of autism. There's some correlations out there that they're studying, but again, there is no known cause yet. So getting back into Cal Poly specific, these are just some general college success factors for all students. So all students to be successful at any college need to have resilience, their social communication and interaction skills, that sort of executive functioning skills, so get the ability to plan and organize, manage their time well, self-regulation, so the coping skills, the emotional control, and that academic ability, obviously. And so the challenge that our students on the spectrum can face in college is, when all those things kind of have to come into play and how their diagnoses can kind of, put those things at odds. So the new routines and environment. So for a lot of our students, kind of, the way they self-regulate sometimes could be that routine. And so in high school, that's really helpful because they know exactly point A to point B, Monday through Friday, their block schedule, that's what they're doing. They get home, they have a snack, they do their homework. It's very routine driven, and that's really helpful. And I used to be a therapist, and I would go in the home and I would enforce that routine, and because that was really helpful, especially mitigating problem behaviors. But when you get to college and you're on your own, sometimes those routines can be broken all the time. Class is canceled, an exam date is moved, your roommate is cranky, you don't know what's going to be thrown at you day in, day out. All the uncertainties of what's going on in our climate right now. So that can be really challenging, especially for the student on the spectrum, when your routine is sort of driving your coping skills. And the social awareness, especially those boundaries. So, I've had a lot of students in my office just have these conversations every quarter, just talking about, how you keep those appropriate boundaries and sort of defining different relationships and sort of, who would you consider an acquaintance? Who would you consider a friend? Who would you consider someone you're dating? And kind of operationally defining all those different things. And making sure we don't have any incidents of accidental stalking. So if they're following someone around or a professor around, but just innocently enough to them, but how it could be misconstrued as something that could be, like I said, considered stalking, but really that's not what their intention was. They're not understanding those boundaries. So just, and again, personal care. So again, maybe the transition from high school where their parents or their caregivers are saying, this is when you shower, this is when you do laundry, all those things. And then when you're left sort of on your own, those can be challenging. And we've had, to kind of talk about with students and be blunt and be like, okay, we need to come up with a schedule of when you're going to do your laundry. And that's okay. But yeah, these are challenges, like I said. Communication with faculty and peers. So like I said, with that social reciprocity, sort of that pragmatic language, that can really be challenging when you need to go to office hours and you need to talk to your professor about maybe an extension on a homework assignment, or you need help studying, and knowing just sort of how to broach that subject, or even just going to office hours and knowing what to say. And so, a lot of what I do with my students is I'll help sort of either craft like a script, or I'll help them write an email, things like that. Or I'll even go with them to office hours. And I'll try not to hold their hand too much, but just having another like advocate in their corner, someone just, kind of help start the conversation, at least get it going, can be helpful. But again, that's a challenge. And a time management organization. I feel like this is challenging for most students, but especially our students with executive functioning challenges, knowing how to manage your time, especially just, how much time is it going to take me to walk from my dorm to my class? So I could tell a lot of my incoming freshmen, your first weekend here, go and map it out. Walk around, time yourself, because that is always a really, really big issue. Is sort of, I'm always late. I don't know why I'm always late. It's like, well, let's figure it out. Let's time yourself. Let's see. It takes you 10 minutes to get from your dorm to your class. Give yourself 15 things, and just giving them sort of little tools like that. But yeah, so that's, because a lot of these skills need to be taught explicitly. Because a lot of our students, they learn these things by imitation, by just growing up and watching others do it, or watching things from the media or whatever. But students on the spectrum, they don't necessarily learn by imitation. That's not their best way of learning. They need to be taught explicitly, discrete trials, things like that. So that's kind of where I'm getting at with, let's time yourself, and me going with them and writing scripts, all that that's kind of what I'm getting at with this. Anybody have any questions? I feel like I'm kind of rambling. No. So in any course on Cal Poly's campus or any college, we're talking about fundamental course objectives and what they require of any student. So they require flexible problem solving, synthetic and categorical thinking, sequential thinking, use of logic, abstract skills, ability to draw inferences, capacity for insight, and to generate those alternative solutions. And so those can be some really abstract thoughts, and those are complicated things to get to, but this is what college requires of you. And faculty doesn't need to compromise on these expectations. And so, and we always, when we're making accommodations, we're telling faculty they don't need to, we don't alter their fundamental course objectives. We just modify things to help support the student. But these are generally what those fundamental course objectives try to get at, to assess their knowledge in the course. So when we look at, accommodations and sort of helping support students, we look at, these are some possible solutions or how you can help in the classroom. So providing a very clear syllabus, like I said, context is everything. So just with really clear course expectations, test dates and due dates all outlined. When I see TBD, sometimes other students can be like, oh, I know the professor will get to it when they get to it. But sometimes my students, that causes a lot of unnecessary stress the professor doesn't realize. So just, having it all mapped out is really, really helpful. Or even just like a rubric for grading, that in of itself is really helpful. I know it might sound kind of, oh, duh, of course, a clear, would be, syllabus would be helpful, but I've seen some that are not. So this is just one of those simple things that if all professors could provide would be a great deal of help. Using the student conduct code, so being very explicit, saying disrupting my class means this. So again, not using inference, and not assuming all students understand and know the course conduct code. And so this is a really important one, because things have happened and students say like, well, I didn't know that was the consequence. I didn't know I could have been expelled, or I was going to get brought into the Office of Student Rights for having an outburst in class. And so letting them know ahead of time, even putting this in your syllabus, is really, really helpful, just so they can know what their clear consequences are. Offer individual meetings with students with clear and direct language. So if you do this, then this, especially if, I think, and this is good for all students, a lot of professors will offer office hours, but sometimes students have classes during those office hours, or they can't make it. And then a lot of students will come to me like, well, I can't go to their office hours, I have class. So they don't know that they can reach out to their professor and ask for an individual meeting. And so sometimes just offering that and letting students know, oh yeah, I can do that. Students will be like, oh, I can email my professor and ask because they said that. And that just opens up the door that a lot of students may have already inferred, but our students on the spectrum may not have. And so that can just be really helpful. Creating concrete rules. So this is really helpful, again, for maybe a student who is monopolizing a lot of class time. So they're raising their hand all the time. They're asking a lot of questions. They're talking a lot. So you can just kind of have a class, impose it on the entire class, not just the one student, obviously, but saying, you know, we want to make sure we're respectful of everybody's time and everybody has a chance to talk. So, you know, in this discussion forum, everybody can ask 3 questions each class or something like that. That way it's it's equal to everybody. Excuse me. We can allow, and this could be a DRC accommodation, but allowing computers for exams when possible. So I have a lot of students who feel like they can get their thoughts out better when typing as opposed to handwriting. So that could be really helpful. Oral versus written projects or vice versa. And that's something, again, where, you know, if it's not fundamental to the course objective, we can work with the professor one-on-one and say, you know, if this is, say, a public speaking class, is there some alternative we could work out? Maybe the student can record it and have that presented, or can they present to a smaller group or just to you or something like that? It's really a challenge, you know, just kind of thinking outside the box of, if it's not a fundamental course objective, how can we modify it? This is a really big helpful one that I wish all professors just did. It's just selecting groups and assigning the tasks in advance. Instead of saying, hey, this is gonna be a group project, find your groups. That just causes and not even just for students on the spectrum, but for a lot of students, that just creates a lot of stress sometimes if you don't already have peers that you know in the class. So it's just so easy, I think, for a professor to be like, all right, you 3 are in a group, you 3 are in a group, done, you know? And then no one has to worry about finding a group, it's already done. And I think that can just eliminate a lot of unnecessary stress. The use of visuals is really helpful. So like I said, like our students who could have like that sensory overload, if sometimes they need to sort of kind of block out what they're hearing. I have a lot of students who might use earplugs. And so that what they're hearing is muffled, but they're really relying on what they're seeing on their screen or on the board. And they're going back and they're kind of teaching themselves sometimes after class. But if they have their earplugs out, they're too distracted by other sounds and it's just too much, you know, stimulation. So the use of visuals can be really helpful. And considering universal design principles when designing your lectures, or UDL it's called. And I'll go into that a little bit on my next slide. And then just referring to campus resources. So if you're not sure how to help a student and you're just looking for additional advice or, you know, whatever it is, you can always call the DRC. That's what we're here for. There's counseling services on campus too. And if you're looking for UDL principles, I'll kind of go over who the point person on campus is for that. So Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. This is just kind of how to make everything accessible to all. So it's not just for that student with autism. It's not just for that other, you know, whatever disability. It's for every student. It's making sure there's multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression, and multiple means of engagement. And so it's giving learners various ways of acquiring information and knowledge. And so I like this little cartoon down here. It says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And so obviously, you know, the fish isn't going to be able to climb the tree. The seal is going to have a challenging time climbing the tree. So it's kind of looking at that framework of, you know, if you give the same assessment, not everyone's going to be able to perform at the same level. Even though you might have that same skill set or knowledge, you might not be able to perform at that same level as your peers. So that's kind of the point of accommodations. We try to level that playing field. But a lot of things professors can do in their classroom without even students having to come to DRC. It's just kind of making sure that they're using UDL principles in general. That could be a whole nother presentation on its own. So I just gave a quick link to the udlcenter.org, which is really helpful. And they have a whole post-secondary section for professors to kind of get tips and tricks and things like that. And then on our campus, if you need assistance with implementing UDL practices, we have Pam Doherty. And she's in the Center for Teaching and Learning and Technology, and she's in Kennedy Library, and she is fantastic. And she welcomes, you know, if people are asking for help with their courses, she is there to help. She's really accessible too. If you email her, call her, those things. So she can really help take, if you have a PDF and you need to make it accessible for a screen reader, she can help do that. certain audio files you want to post to your Polylearn, all those things she can help with. And then, so we have our connections coordinator here, Miss Adrian. Do you want to go over this? Yeah. So I'm not sure if anybody on Zoom heard that, but we have an ASD self-advocacy team and network that meets every Friday in room 224, and the information is on our website. Yeah. It's mostly student led. So they, oh, mine? Oh, okay. Great. Oh, great. I mean, I see you probably every day. Well, I was just going to open it up to questions if this thing is going to work. Sorry, this is not cooperating. I'm just going to open up to questions if anybody has any. Oops. At the DRC total? Oh, for autism? Well, that's a hard number to pin down. Yeah. Well, it's, we have some students that'll self-identify as autism as their primary disability. And then we have some that'll say it's their secondary disability to maybe ADHD or something like that. So that's why it's kind of challenging to say specifically, oh, we have this many. Yeah, I don't have an exact number in my head.
I'll pull up what our latest marks now. But yeah, like Tina said, not everybody.
Do our Zoom people have any questions?
Can you repeat question from audience?
Oh, just on our numbers right now at the DRC, but we don't have an exact count. I don't, at the top of my head, I don't have an exact count. My caseload specifically is around 450, but not all of them have autism. I think total at DRC is a little over 2,000 registered students.
So 46 students.
As their primary?
Yeah, we have almost 2,200 right now registered, active, but 46 with the diagnosis of autism.
Yeah, so we have 46 with a primary diagnosis of autism.
Is your office diagnosed?
No.
No.
Oh yeah, so the last question is if our office diagnoses, and we do not diagnose. Yeah, I think there is a community referral page, and there are some people in the community that we could say they've been vetted and they can go to. For autism specifically, that would either be from a primary care physician or a psychiatrist, usually, that would diagnose. And typically students are getting diagnosed when they're younger. But it's not unheard of to get diagnosed as an adult if you feel like, I've been noticing a lot of these symptoms, and I've maybe read online, and kind of bringing that to your primary care physician and saying, hey, I was wondering if this is what I'm experiencing. So, that happens too. Any more questions? No? Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
So we can just see the slides on the website.
Yeah, I can. Well, can we see the slides on the? You can see the presentation on the website, but I can email. Yeah, if you put your email on the sign-in list, I can email you the slides too. So, do I just click that? And that. Okay. Did I disconnect it properly? Probably not. I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, leave meeting. Leave me. I said